Hi, everyone. Hello, and welcome to the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm Jessie Mayer. I'm the Donor Engagement Coordinator here at the museum, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the third annual Jewish Book Festival. Thank you for joining us for Salinger's Soul with Stephen B. Shepard and Lisa Newman, co-presented by the Yiddish Book Center. We hope you've been able to explore some of the 17 panels that are happening throughout the museum today, meet some of the 56 speakers, and attend one of our 3 writing workshops and get books signed at some of the 16 author signings. We also hope you will join us for Gur Suite, a concert by Marcin Masecki and Gur Mandolin Orchestra at 6 p.m. in Safra Hall on the first floor. While you're here, we also encourage you to visit our exhibitions in our cafe Locks on the second floor. The whole museum is open to you today. You can also pick up holiday gifts at the Pickman Museum shop and purchase the books discussed today through McNally Jackson in our first floor lobby. This program is made possible in part by support from the Battery Park City Authority. Your donations also help us present programs like these. And now I'm pleased to introduce our speakers. Stephen B. Shepard is the founding Dean Emeritus of the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at the City University of New York. He served as a senior editor at Newsweek, the editor of Saturday Review, and he also served as the editor-in-chief of Business Week. Lisa Newman is Director of Publishing and Public Programs and Director of White Goat Press, the Yiddish Book Center's imprint, and host of The Schmooze, the Center's podcast. Prior to joining the Yiddish Book Center, Lisa managed public relations and publishing projects for a variety of nonprofit and corporate clients. Thank you again for joining us today, and I'm going to hand things over to our speakers.
Thank you. I want to thank the museum for making this opportunity possible, and Stephen for joining me here today. This is really exciting. I was a little bit late. I was on a panel about Yiddish translation, which is much of the work of the center is doing Yiddish in translation. And it was really fun to connect with Stephen Shepard, whose other work I've really enjoyed, to think about the sort of thread that goes through from Yiddish work as part of the chapter of Jewish contemporary literature. So I'm eager to speak with you today about your latest book, which is about Salinger. So my first question for you is, what drew you to this?
Well, first of all, let me say thanks. Thanks, Jessie, for that introduction, and thank you all for joining us today. Happy to do this. Lisa, thank you. What drew me to this? Well, in 2018, I wrote a book about the Jewish American writers. You know, Saul Bellow, Philip Roth, Bernard Malamud, Cynthia Ozick, and all the other Jewish American writers in post-war America that created a kind of golden age for Jewish writers. I thought at the time of including J.D. Salinger, but for various reasons I didn't. And one of the reasons was that his Jewishness was a rather complicated issue, which we can get into a little bit later. And then when COVID hit in March 2020, I had a lot of material on Salinger, and I decided to do some more research and did a lot and realized there was a separate book to do on him and his work and his religion. You know, he wasn't really a Jewish writer, as we'll discuss, but he certainly was a religious writer. And it was fascinating to do this, and it's very relevant. I mean, I was thinking, why am I here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage for a man who abandoned his Jewishness? But we can talk about that.
Which is part of the reason that you are here, because I think it is part of the conversation. So my first introduction to you, Stephen, was the book, I'm totally blanking because I'm in another zone right now, A Literary Journey to Jewish Identity, Rereading Bellow, Roth, Malamud, Ozick, and Other Great Jewish Writers, a book I also really enjoyed, and I love the idea of reflecting back. I mean, it's something at this point in my life I can do as well, and we come to books and to writers differently many decades later. So I was, after reading about Salinger, curious to ask you, when you set out to write this, were you considering Salinger as a Jewish American writer in the way that you would consider Roth, Bellow, Paley?
Well, I thought about it until I dug into it some more. His father was Jewish, and his mother was not Jewish. But what happened was his mother, when she married Saul Salinger back in the 1910s, wasn't much approved that a Jewish man would marry a non-Jewish woman. And so she changed her last name from Jillich to Salinger, and also changed her first name from Marie to Miriam, which of course was the name of Moses' sister. And then she passed as Jewish until Salinger was bar mitzvahed, and he and his 19-year-old sister found out that their mother really wasn't Jewish. So that's a big part of his identity as a religious writer, but not so much as a Jewish writer, because he was very, very close to his mother, who was not Jewish, he found out, and he had all kinds of difficulties with his father, who disdained his ambition to be a writer. And so in a way, he chose his mother partly because she wasn't Jewish.
I will say that we have not discussed the questions, and you're doing a beautiful job of segueing to my next question, so thank you. Because I want to ask you what your thoughts are about his characters, and how they may be some sort of an extension or not, or his experience with Jewishness growing up.
Well, the main character in Salinger's fiction, of course, is Holden Caulfield, the 16-year-old protagonist of The Catcher in the Rye. There's nothing Jewish in that book, and there's really very, very little religion in it. Holden is an anguished teenager who's having a transition from being a child, going through adolescence, and coming out on the other side as an adult, and he had great trouble doing that. Catcher in the Rye is really a book about, it's a coming-of-age story about a kid who doesn't want to come of age, does not want to grow up, does not want to give up the innocence of his youth for what he saw as, quote, the phoniness of adult life. And that really reflects a little bit of Salinger and his difficulty with his father for the most part, and how he abandoned Judaism, which was a way of abandoning his father. So in some ways, Holden does reflect Salinger, but all of us back, the book came out in 1951, and when I got around to reading it some years later, I didn't know this stuff about Salinger, so I just read it as a book and didn't relate it to Salinger's character until much, much later, in fact, until I started doing the research for this.
It was interesting because when I think back on when I read it, there's the whole idea of otherness. I think, there was still a period in the 60s where the experience of anti-Semitism growing up, passing, what is that identity I want to have, was part of growing up. And so I think that was something that maybe even not consciously was drawn out in terms of reading these characters at that point in life, and now looking back on it, and we'll get into more of the religious aspect of his life.
In his fiction, he only wrote 2 stories that had anything at all to do with Judaism. They were 2 short stories that most people don't really know anymore. One was called A Girl I Knew, which was published in Good Housekeeping magazine in 1948, and the other one was Uncle Wiggily in Connecticut, I guess.
Yeah.
The Jewish part was really very, very small, but it does touch on anti-Semitism a little bit. And that's it. There was nothing else Jewish in his life. There was nothing else Jewish in his fiction.
Yeah. So I was going to ask if you would read a short passage, and then we can pick up this conversation.
Yeah. Okay. The context is because we haven't talked about his experience in World War II. This excerpt early in the book was when Salinger was in the Army. He was a member of the Counterintelligence Corps. Essentially, he was a kind of spy for the American side, the Allied side. His job, because he was fluent in German, which I can tell you why later, his job was to interview German POWs and try to ferret out any Germans hiding in the local society in France after Germany took over France. So this takes place when his unit, at the very end of the war, the fighting had stopped, and his unit liberated a concentration camp. And then after that, Salinger spent 10 months in continuous combat. He landed at Normandy. Everything was fine until the end, liberated a concentration camp, and then 3 weeks later had a nervous breakdown. So that's the context for this short excerpt. Perhaps Salinger's most devastating wartime experience occurred when his 4th Infantry Division liberated several Nazi concentration camps. On April 27, 1945, just days before the war in Europe officially ended on May 8th, American soldiers discovered a place called Kaufering Lager 4, one of 11 slave labor camps that were satellites of the concentration camp at Dachau, about 45 miles away. Salinger's unit arrived the next day, and he was an eyewitness to the horror of the fleeing Nazis left behind, including the charred bodies of Jews too sick to leave, who were simply burned to death in their barracks. Elsewhere, the bodies of emaciated Jews were there who had starved to death or been shot by the Nazis. It was a traumatic experience for Salinger and many other GIs. Peggy, his daughter, later said that her father told her, quote, "You never really get the smell of burning flesh out of your nose entirely, no matter how long you live." After the fighting ended, Salinger was assigned to an outpost near Nuremberg. It didn't go well. He sank into a profound depression, a combination of combat shock, battle fatigue, and survivor guilt that today we would call post-traumatic stress syndrome, PTSD. Salinger himself called it a nervous breakdown. Did Jewish GIs react differently to what they found in liberated concentration camps? Did Salinger? We have no way of knowing whether Salinger's Jewish heritage contributed to his subsequent breakdown. But it's worth noting that his collapse did not follow the catastrophic fighting he encountered in the Hurtgen Forest or during the Battle of the Bulge. It struck him soon after his unit liberated a concentration camp whose victims were nearly all Jews. Salinger was depressed on and off for the rest of his life.
So
That's called traumatic.
the war had a profound effect on Salinger. Can you speak about the exploration of Buddhism and the practice of Vedanta, which, some say parallels Judaism, but that was sort of bringing him out of this?
Yeah. Because he was depressed, he tried to find solace in religion. And because he had abandoned Judaism, he first experimented with several Eastern religions, starting with Zen Buddhism. And one of his short stories, Franny, which was later printed in the book Franny and Zooey, Franny was actually practicing Christian, so he dealt with Christianity and then Zen Buddhism. And ultimately, he settled on this mystical form of Hinduism, which is called Vedanta. And this is why my subtitle of the book is Salinger's Soul, His Personal and Religious Odyssey, because there was a religious odyssey. He was very, very in need of religion, and he settled on Vedanta because it was a religion which coexisted with other religions that really tried to develop a personal relationship with God. To see God, to be one with God, was one of the principles of Vedanta. And he was a very serious practitioner of it. He did meditations, he read sacred texts. He really was involved with this. And he found solace, and I think it helped him deal with his depression. And Vedanta does appear in some of his fiction after Catcher in the Rye. It's in some of the short stories. And also in Zooey, Seymour, an Introduction, and Raise High the Roof Beam Carpenters. There's a little bit of Vedanta in those stories. So it did influence his fiction.
I'll stop now to say, as a reader, your research is amazing. And just, how you bring his work into it at different points and what it means. And I confess I had no knowledge of how much of his work was in the New Yorker, and how this really was a very successful start for a young writer. And then want to ask you to speak a little bit about the relationship with William Shawn, which also seems interesting because they both, Salinger and Shawn, have very distinctive characters.
Yeah, big question. He started out with the magazines that are known as the Slicks: Good Housekeeping, Cosmopolitan, Collier's, Saturday Evening Post, Esquire. And it wasn't until, well, in 1941, he did write a short story that was accepted by the New Yorker, but then Pearl Harbor happened. And they postponed it because it was really a story about Holden Caulfield, and nobody wanted to read a story about a teenager who whines a lot when we're about to go to war. And so that story did not appear until after the war, and it was published in 1946. But most of his short stories were in these other magazines. But then the New Yorker started accepting some of the stories. And two of the ones that I like the most, which are in his 9 Stories book, are A Perfect Day for Banana Fish, which I'm sure some of you know, and I think one of his best stories, For Esme with Love and Squalor. Both of those stories, by the way, dealt with damaged soldiers from the war. And Banana Fish, Seymour, the protagonist, ends up committing suicide. And Salinger's response to his trauma from World War II was to commit a form of suicide, which was to going into self-exile, into seclusion in Cornish, New Hampshire, where he spent the last 45 years of his life there. What was the other part of the New Yorker? Oh, so
the relationship.
So 7 of the 9 stories in 9 Stories were first published in the New Yorker, and the other 2 were published in other magazines. And he developed first a relationship with Harold Ross, who was the founding editor of the New Yorker, who died, and then William Shawn took his place. The other 2 editors worth mentioning who dealt with him were Gus Lebrano and William Maxwell. But Shawn made the ultimate decisions about what to publish, and some of his stories took up entire issues of the New Yorker. So he became very associated with the New Yorker.
I was fascinated too, because I mean, William Shawn in and of himself is worthy of a book in terms of his idiosyncrasies, can I say? I mean, brilliant. And that he championed Salinger and took him on was unusual. I mean, he didn't have that relationship with most of their writers, correct?
That's right.
What do you think that was the thread that brought them together?
I think one of the threads was neither one of them went to college or lasted in college. He liked Shawn. He got along very well with Ross. The other editors who were dealing with the copy in the first place wanted to turn down some of Salinger's stories, and frankly, some of Salinger's latest stories, partly because they were influenced by Vedanta and religion, were not very good. I mean, Zooey is not a very good story, you know. Seymour, an introduction, is not very, and his last story, which took up an entire issue of the New Yorker, was called Hapworth 16, 1924. Took up an entire issue. By common consent, it's a terrible story. And it was the last published story he ever did. But it took up the entire issue of the New Yorker, only because William Shawn wanted it, because Lebrano and Maxwell thought they shouldn't print it. And they probably were right. But
What's your sense of his going into this self-imposed exile? I mean, you write about how he goes to find a quieter place.
there were several reasons that he did it. One was a genuine need for privacy. He wanted to be a private person, so much so that when Catcher in the Rye had, in the first edition or two, had his photograph on the back cover, the dust jacket.
Right.
And by the third edition, he had it taken off of the thing. He didn't want anyone to recognize him. He didn't want to know anyone. He really wanted to be in seclusion. Now, he came out of seclusion some of the time, but basically he led a very secluded life for those decades afterward. And part of it also was he needed the privacy to do his writing. He had built a writing bunker near his house, and he went there every day and stayed there all day, sometimes slept there. He wrote constantly every day of his life for the last 45 years after his last story was published. He wrote every day, and nothing was published. And the other reason was, as I later found out, the personal part of this personal odyssey is his obsession with young women. He never dealt with any underage women, but he had an obsession with what he called, one of his characters called, post-adolescent women, women in the last minutes of their girlhood, which is to say women older than 18, 19. Claire Douglas, his second wife and mother of his children, was 22 when he married her, and he was, almost 40. And he had this obsession with young women, and you probably all know about his affair with Joyce Maynard, who dropped out of Yale after her freshman year to live with him in Cornish, New Hampshire for almost a year. She was 18 or 19, and he was 53. And this was a common thing with Salinger. He had a lot of affairs with young women. And I think that was part of why he wanted the privacy of a secluded place in Cornish, New Hampshire, which is really not much of a town at all. So those are the reasons. The writing, the obsession with women, and the practice of Vedanta and religion could do in a more private setting.
And you point out the amount of people who have purchased his books is just, it's enviable, wouldn't even begin to approach it, how many of these sell. But yet, we sort of have, we have Salinger as the recluse, Salinger as exiled, as being the thing that gained him, if I may, so much notoriety. It was that fascination with his disappearing from public sight.
He became famous for not wanting to be famous. Yeah.
Do you think that was something that? Well, I think you do write about it. He didn't enjoy that notoriety.
No, he really didn't. I mean, I think that was genuine. Catcher in the Rye has sold 65 million copies since it was published in 1951. And if you don't count the Bible, it's one of the 2 or 3 best-selling novels of the 20th century. It really is extraordinary. And to this day, it's selling about 200,000 copies a year. 200,000 copies a year. I mean, it takes about 25,000 to get on the New York Times bestseller list over a period of a few weeks. So this is an extraordinary thing. It's on so many high school and college reading lists that's why it sells so many. And so financially, he didn't have any worries at all, and he could afford to live in seclusion and not talk to anybody and do whatever the hell he wanted because the book was so lucrative.
And this may be a strange question, but I'll pose it anyway, which is, he writes about adolescence. He writes about that period in our life, which becomes so easy for so many of us to identify with. And he does it very brilliantly, which explains why he keeps selling the book. He goes into World War II. He has that trauma. I always wonder if he wanted everything to stop at that point of innocence in his life, or the normal adolescence turmoil, and that's what he was trying to preserve, because that was the place he wanted to come back to.
He did not, even though he wrote every day for 45 years and didn't publish a word, he did not rule out that the material would be published after he died. And his son, Matt Salinger, who lives in Connecticut, has all the unpublished stories that Salinger wrote but did not publish. And think about it. He wrote every single day for 45 years and didn't publish a word of it. And his son has been sorting through this thing for the better part of 10 years and is said to be releasing this material sometime relatively soon. It could come in the next year or so. It could come next week, I pray. But we're going to see more material, and I think we'll have a lot of answers to the questions about Salinger. Did he write anything really good after that? There's so much. Some of it is bound to be good because he was such a good writer. But maybe it was all influenced by Vedanta and got more proselytizing than literary, because he was proselytizing about Vedanta.
Yeah.
And that's not good for literature. And
No.
That's probably why some of those stories weren't very good. So we'll see. We got a lot to look forward to.
Before we open it up for questions, I was curious, did you discover the writer that you set out to write about?
Yeah, what I didn't discover is the man I wanted to know even more. I learned a lot of fascinating things about him. I get asked all the time, well, did you like J.D. Salinger after doing all this, or did you like him as a person? And I find that very hard to answer, because there were moments I wanted to wring his neck, you know, the way he treated his children and his wife and so on. It was really, you know, not nice and not likable. On the other hand, you know, I wanted him to succeed. I wanted him to sort of find happiness. And I wasn't happy that he was a depressed person.
Yeah.
So, but he created some amazing characters. I mean, he often wrote about young people and children, and often between the relationship of an adult and children. So, for example, in one of the best short stories ever written, in my view, for Esme with Love and Squalor, Esme is a 13-year-old girl who's taking care of her 7-year-old brother. They are orphaned in the war, and they encounter a veteran who was damaged by the war psychologically, called Sergeant X in this story. And the relationship between Sergeant X and Esme is just brilliant. I mean, he was just so good when he was writing about that kind of thing. The other thing that's noteworthy, because he was always dealing with young people, there is no sex in a Salinger story. There's really none. Even though he had all kinds of affairs with all kinds of women, there is nothing about that in any of his fiction.
It's very internalized somewhat. And you also write about it, the acknowledgement that his dialogue was so strong.
Salinger was not a great storyteller. That is, he was not great at narrative writing or plot in the way some writers are. But he was really very, very good at building character. You know, Esme, Sergeant X, Holden Caulfield. And it's because he had this amazing gift for dialogue. And Catcher, of course, is a monologue of this teenage boy going through all this distress. And he tells a story through dialogue in a way that few writers were really able to do. And he developed a kind of stream of consciousness technique, which is apparent in Catcher in the Rye, which is very reminiscent of James Joyce and Virginia Woolf, where you get to the inner life of his characters. And to do that just through dialogue, you know, not narrative explaining this and that, is really amazing. And that's what his great talent as a writer was this gift for dialogue.
The other thing that surprised me was you write about his time in Vermont, and he's, you know, in an exile or recluse, but he's out there within that community. He's not.
Well, he was originally, when he first
Yeah.
moved to Cornish, New Hampshire, which is right across the river from Windsor, Vermont,
Yeah.
which is where he had to go every day to get his newspapers and stuff. What was it?
But then does he start to retreat
Yeah,
from
then
that?
so he was out and about, and he became very friendly with a group of high school students in Windsor, Vermont. He invited them to his house and all of that. And he gave an interview to this young woman named Sheila Blaney. Blaney is her last name. And he thought it was for a school project, which is what he said. And it ended up being on the front page of the local paper in Windsor, Vermont. And from then on, he had nothing to do, not only with the high school students, but with anybody. He built a big fence around his property, and that's when he really went into seclusion. And that was about the time of when 9 Stories was published in no, it was a little later, mid-50s, I would say.
It kind of hurt that I felt for him that he was betrayed. Was this? There's a lot of, as I say, you do a brilliant job of researching and taking us through his life and writing. Was it a hard book to research?
Well, if you read everything that was ever written, you'd find that.
Yeah.
I didn't interview anybody because his son, Matt Salinger, who was really the one I wanted to talk to, would not speak to me or acknowledge that I was doing this book in any way. And his daughter, Peggy, wrote a memoir of her own, as did Joyce Maynard. So there was a lot of material about him. So you could kind of do it, but without, it was a little bit like, you know, reading Hamlet without the soliloquies. You know, you didn't have Salinger's voice other than when he was publicly quoted or in his letters. His letters were a big deal.
Yeah.
The letters provided a lot of information about him. So, but he had a lot of friends. I mean, his World War II buddies remained lifelong friends. John Keenan was in his Jeep during most of the war, And when he was retired, he became a New York City policeman. And when he was retiring from the police force, Salinger drove from Cornish, New Hampshire to Queens in New York to be at John Keenan's farewell party to the police department. He had a lot of good friends, including Judge Leonard Hand, who spent summers in Cornish, New Hampshire. Elizabeth Murray, who was a sister of one of his high school friends. So he did have good friendships. He was quick to, punish anyone he thought was disloyal, but he did maintain some very good friendships.
An interesting character. I'm going to open it up to questions at this point, if I may. Yeah, whoops, sorry. If you can speak loudly, that would be great.
I just was wondering if he maintained any relationships with other authors of the era.
Good question. As far as I know, the answer is no. Well, during the war, yeah, that's true. My wife reminds me that during the war, when his unit helped liberate Paris from the Nazis, he sought out Ernest Hemingway, who he knew was in Paris covering the war. And so he actually sought out Ernest Hemingway, whose fiction he really didn't like. He much preferred F. Scott Fitzgerald, but he became friends with Hemingway. And that friendship went on for quite a few years after the war until, certainly until Catcher in the Rye came out in '51 and a little bit after that. But beyond that, I don't know. Do you remember any others, Lynn? No, he wasn't really yeah. He was infatuated with his own writing, is what the truth was.
Yeah.
Just very quick, you had mentioned that he spoke fluent German, and you were going to explain why later.
Oh, yeah. So, after he dropped out of, he was not a very good student, and he was in PS 166 on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and his father was more social climber than an observant Jew, transferred him into the McBurney School, which was affiliated with the YWCA, the C being a very Christian thing that appealed to his father, but he flunked out of McBurney in 2 years, and then he went to Valley Forge Military Academy in Pennsylvania. After that, he didn't want to go in his father's business, so his father sent him to Europe to work he had a food importing business, to work in Europe for the food importing business. Instead of working for the food importing, he lived in Venice for almost a year. And, Vienna, thank you. And that's where he became fluent in German. He was almost a year in there, and then he got out about a week before the Nazis annexed Austria and made all the Jews of Vienna scrub the streets and things like that. He got out 1 week before that happened. And the other thing is he lived with a Jewish family there, and after the war he went back to see if they were still there, and they'd all been killed by the Germans.
Yeah, I'm just curious, when you say he had sought out Hemingway, I'm just kind of curious, because he didn't like the writing. Hemingway was famous for, he's also, he's out of the fiction, he's a man's man. Was there any, is there known what the fascination was to seek him out?
Just that he was a famous writer. And while he wasn't, he didn't hate his fiction, it's just that he admired F. Scott Fitzgerald much more. But he wanted to seek him out, and he did. So one was a rookie writer, right, and the other was a legend, and they became friends. Salinger very much liked that.
Yeah.
I was just curious, Philip Roth wrote a book called The Ghostwriter, where Zuckerman manages to make contact with this reclusive writer. Was there any allusion to
Oh.
Salinger at all? Or nothing of that?
That's a very good point. I never thought of it that way. I know the story you're talking about, the ghostwriter. No, what's interesting to me about Philip Roth is not that they had any kind of a relationship. Goodbye Columbus came out a little later, 1959, which was Roth's first big book, well after, Salinger did Catcher and 9 Stories. Roth, I thought about all these Jewish writers, partly because of the previous book I wrote, The only one who really got better with age, they all deteriorated. Salinger, obviously, his later stuff is not as good as his earlier stuff, but that's true of Saul Bellow and Bernard Malamud, Ozick a little bit. But the one writer who actually got better with age, or at least not worse, was Philip Roth. His later books were among his best. And that was not true of not only the Jewish writers, but people like John Updike, who's also deteriorated. So that was very unusual about Roth, but Salinger was not blessed with that success in his later books.
Anyone else have any questions?
Well, I'll
Oh,
ask the one thing that
yeah.
comes to mind, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Is there any hints, when you say that we don't know if his later writing is good or bad, because we haven't seen it, is there any hints of, you're suggesting not, but I'm just wondering if there's anything out there about what it is.
Everybody's trying to find this out, and Matt Salinger, his son, has not said a word about it, except in 2019, 5 years ago, New York Public Library had a big Salinger exhibit, and Matt Salinger was there and spoke to the press at that time. So we know there's a lot of stuff. He wouldn't say whether it was short stories, whether it was another novel. He wouldn't say anything about it, and he committed in a vague way to a time frame which suggests it's about now or within the next year or so. That doesn't mean it will be, but we have no idea what it is. He said he's going to release it all, which is astonishing because there's probably a lot of stuff. So I don't know what's going to happen, but it's going to be a major literary event, that's for sure. And everybody will be looking to see, did Salinger capture some of the old magic? Don't know.
Do you know if there's a publisher for it, or?
Don't know anything.
gonna be the
But I
big
mean, how much,
thing, yeah.
what publisher's going to publish? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
But suppose he wrote, I'm making this up, 30 short stories and one novel. Okay, that could be published. But suppose he wrote, 75 short stories, and suppose he wrote 2 novels or 3 novels, and some of them aren't good. What's going to happen? I don't know. I think it's going to be a field day for scholars. And if we're lucky, it's going to be a field day for people like all of us.
Well, we'll leave it at that then. We'll look forward to the field day. But in the meantime, thank you so much for yet another really great read. I encourage you to go downstairs where Stephen will be signing the book. Is it?
Event hall?
Oh, okay.
Jesse.
Is this where? Yeah.
She'll tell us. Come,
Oh,
please.
okay.
rescue us from our ignorance.
Thank you. But wherever it is, go. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
So thank you so much to Stephen B. Shepard and to Lisa Newman for such a great discussion, and thank you to our audience for joining.